He ruled England for 38 years. He married 6 women. He shattered the power of Rome and changed the course of English history forever. But none of that is the darkest part of his reign. The real story of Henry VIII is written in blood. 10 names, 10 lives, men and women who were brilliant, loyal, powerful, faithful, and in some cases completely innocent. One by one, they were erased because they stood between a king and his obsession with absolute control. This is not the story of England's greatest Tudor king. This is the story of a ruler whose greatest weapon was fear. By the end of this documentary, you won't remember Henry for his palaces, his wives, or his victories. You'll remember him as a man who destroyed an entire generation of England's finest minds simply to protect his own throne. And stay until the very end, because the final execution reveals a truth more terrifying than any battlefield. Henry VIII didn't destroy his enemies. With every execution, he destroyed himself. London, May 1521. The streets were silent as soldiers escorted one of England's most powerful noblemen toward Tower Hill. Edward Stafford, Duke of Buckingham, was second only to the king in wealth and influence. He owned vast estates, commanded enormous respect, and carried something Henry VIII feared more than armies. He carried Plantagenet blood, the blood of England's former royal dynasty. Around the royal court, whispers spread that Buckingham had consulted astrologers and fortune-tellers who predicted he might one day wear the crown. There was no convincing evidence of a conspiracy, only rumors, suspicion, and a king who had already decided that possibility alone was too dangerous to ignore. Henry didn't need proof. He needed obedience. Buckingham was convicted of treason and led to the scaffold. When the executioner's axe fell, it did more than kill a duke. It sent a message to every noble family in England. From that day forward, birth, wealth, and ancient bloodlines offered no protection. Under Henry VIII, standing too close to the throne could be a death sentence. As the years passed, Henry changed. The handsome Renaissance prince admired across Europe slowly disappeared. In his place emerged a king consumed by one desperate obsession: a male heir. His marriage to Catherine of Aragon had failed to produce the son he believed England needed. When the Pope refused to grant him a divorce, Henry chose an extraordinary path. He broke England away from the Roman Catholic Church, declared himself supreme head of the Church of England, and demanded absolute loyalty from every subject. One man refused: Thomas More. Thomas More was one of the most respected scholars in Europe. A celebrated author, lawyer, and Lord Chancellor, he had once been among Henry's closest advisors. He never called for rebellion. He never raised an army. He never plotted against the king. His only crime was refusing to acknowledge Henry as head of the church. He remained silent, believing that his conscience belonged to God alone. That silence sealed his fate. Imprisoned in the Tower of London for more than a year, More endured relentless pressure to surrender. Freedom, wealth, and even his life were offered in exchange for a few spoken words. He refused every offer. On July 6, 1535, dressed in a crimson robe, he climbed the scaffold with remarkable calm. He joked with the executioner, forgave those responsible for his death, prayed quietly, and accepted his fate. Henry believed he had erased a political enemy. Instead, he created one of history's most famous martyrs. Nearly 4 centuries later, the Catholic Church canonized Thomas More as a saint. The king had won the execution. History gave More the victory. Henry's fury did not end there. Only weeks later, another respected figure walked toward the executioner's block. John Fisher, Bishop of Rochester, was 75 years old, frail, and admired throughout Christian Europe. Despite imprisonment and failing health, he refused to recognize Henry's religious authority. When Pope Paul III elevated Fisher to the rank of cardinal, Henry interpreted it as a direct challenge to his authority. Fisher was repeatedly offered mercy if he would simply swear the required oath. He refused, declaring that no earthly king could replace God's authority. On June 22, 1535, he was beheaded. His severed head was displayed on London Bridge for weeks as a warning to anyone whose loyalty to faith exceeded loyalty to the crown. Yet Fisher's letters survived. In them, he described Henry not as England's savior, but as a tyrant willing to destroy both justice and religion to satisfy his own ambition. With Rome defeated and opposition silenced, Henry believed happiness was finally within reach. And Boleyn had captured his heart, inspired England's religious revolution, and transformed European politics. Intelligent, ambitious, and fiercely independent, she became queen after years of controversy. But she failed to give Henry what he wanted most, a surviving son. Instead, she gave birth to Princess Elizabeth, a child who would one day become one of England's greatest monarchs. At the time, however, Elizabeth was seen as a disappointment. In the spring of 1536, accusations suddenly surrounded Anne. Adultery, treason, even incest with her own brother, George Boleyn. Most modern historians consider the charges fabricated or deeply unreliable, created to remove a queen who had become politically inconvenient. The outcome was virtually certain before proceedings even began, and faced death with extraordinary dignity, insisting she had been a faithful wife to the king. A French swordsman ended her life with a single strike. George Boleyn had already been executed days earlier after proclaiming his innocence. Henry had not only destroyed his queen, he had wiped out an entire branch of one of England's most influential families. Yet even after Anne's death, Henry found no peace. Every failed marriage demanded another scapegoat. Every disappointment required another victim. Eventually, suspicion turned toward the man who had helped make Henry's revolution possible. Thomas Cromwell. Cromwell had risen from humble origins to become the most powerful minister in England. He reorganized the government, dissolved the monasteries, strengthened royal authority, and transformed the Tudor state. For years, he solved every political crisis Henry created. But even Cromwell could not survive the king's changing moods. Hoping to strengthen England's alliances, he arranged Henry's marriage to Anne of Cleves, a German princess. Henry disliked the marriage almost immediately and blamed Cromwell for his humiliation. Service meant nothing. Loyalty meant nothing. 2 decades of devotion vanished overnight. Arrested on charges of treason and heresy, Cromwell desperately wrote letter after letter begging Henry for mercy. None received a reply. On July 28, 1540, he was executed after a painfully botched beheading. The architect of Tudor power became another victim of the machine he had helped build. By the early 1540s, Henry's health had collapsed. Years of injuries, illness, and obesity left him in constant pain. The once athletic king became increasingly suspicious, unpredictable, and ruthless. Enemies seemed to exist everywhere, even within his own family. That paranoia reached one of its darkest moments with Margaret Pole, Countess of Salisbury. She was 67 years old, one of the last surviving members of the Plantagenet dynasty, and a grandmother who had spent decades serving the crown. She had not led a rebellion. She had not declared war. Her greatest misfortune was her family name and the actions of her son. Henry decided that was enough. On Tower Green, the elderly countess reportedly refused to place her head upon the block, declaring that she was no traitor. The inexperienced executioner struggled repeatedly before finally killing her in a horrifying scene witnessed by stunned onlookers. England had now learned that neither age, innocence, nor lifelong loyalty could protect anyone from Henry's fear. The king's 5th marriage offered no escape from the cycle of violence. Catherine Howard was little more than a teenager when she married the aging king. She entered a royal court filled with intrigue, expectations, and impossible pressures. When evidence of past relationships and alleged affairs surfaced, Henry interpreted them not as youthful mistakes but as unforgivable betrayal. Catherine was condemned to death. On the night before her execution, tradition holds that she practiced placing her head upon the executioner's block so she would face death with dignity. On February 13, 1542, she was beheaded inside the Tower of London. Henry had now executed 2 of his own queens. Yet the son he desired still remained beyond his reach. The executions expanded beyond politics and marriage into matters of faith. And Askew was a young Protestant gentlewoman whose belief that ordinary people should read the Bible in English brought her into conflict with powerful religious authorities. Refusing to abandon her convictions, she was arrested and subjected to one of the most brutal forms of torture used in Tudor England. Stretched on the rack inside the Tower of London, her body was torn apart in an attempt to force names from her and make her abandon her beliefs. She refused. Unable even to walk, she had to be carried to the stake on a chair. In July 1546, at only 25 years old, an Askew was burned alive. Henry's government was no longer executing people only for threatening the crown. It was destroying those whose beliefs challenged authority itself. The final months of Henry's life revealed that even approaching death could not quiet his fears. Weak, bedridden, and increasingly isolated, he signed one last death warrant. Henry Howard, Earl of Surrey, was among England's finest poets, a respected soldier, and heir to one of the kingdom's greatest noble families. He was accused of displaying royal arms to which he had questionable claim, a charge interpreted as evidence that he secretly aspired to the throne. Whether true or not hardly mattered. On January 19, 1547, Surrey was beheaded. Less than 2 weeks later, Henry VIII himself was dead. 10 executions, 10 shattered lives. A duke destroyed because his bloodline frightened a king. A saint executed because his conscience could not be bought. A bishop killed because faith outweighed obedience. A queen and her brother sacrificed for political convenience. A minister abandoned after decades of service. An elderly countess butchered because of her ancestry. A teenage queen condemned by impossible expectations. A young woman burned for refusing to betray her beliefs. A gifted poet silenced because a dying king feared the future. But here is the truth history often overlooks. Henry VIII did not execute these people because they threatened England. He executed them because they threatened his own sense of security. Every death reflected the same fear. Fear of losing power. Fear of leaving no male heir. Fear that history might remember someone else more than it remembered him. In trying to protect his dynasty, Henry destroyed it. The son he fought so desperately to secure, Edward VI, died before reaching adulthood. The daughter he declared illegitimate, Elizabeth, became one of England's greatest rulers and shaped an era that still bears her name. The church Henry created continues to exist centuries later. Yet, when people remember Henry VIII today, they remember not the empire he strengthened or the laws he passed. They remember the scaffold, the axe, the Tower of London, and the endless trail of blood that followed him through history. Henry VIII wanted history to remember him as one of England's greatest kings. Instead, history remembers him as the ruler who believed fear was stronger than justice. He silenced voices, destroyed families, executed loyal servants, and imagined that every death made his throne safer. But every execution weakened the legacy he fought so desperately to preserve. In the end, Henry conquered nobles, ministers, bishops, queens, scholars, and poets. The only thing he could never conquer was time. Centuries later, the people he tried to erase are remembered with admiration, sympathy, and respect. The king who condemned them is remembered for the blood on his hands. That is the greatest irony of all. Henry VIII spent his entire life trying to control history, and history judged him guilty.